Welcome, restless souls, to another midnight journey into history's forgotten pain. Before we step into the cold shadows of the past, I ask one simple thing. Tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time the darkness finds you tonight. Whether you're nestled under blankets in Manchester, quietly listening in Seoul, or somewhere in between, you matter. If these late-night reflections on the lost and the voiceless move, you consider subscribing so you never miss another step into history's silence. Now, take a breath, dim the lights, and prepare yourself. For what we are about to uncover may forever shift how you view the fragile wonder of childhood. Imagine a world where laughter is rare and children's cries are not met with comfort but ignored. A world where small hands, meant for discovery, and play are calloused by labor and cracked by cold. A world where childhood is a luxury only the wealthy can afford, and the poor are expected to carry burdens beyond their size from the moment they can stand. This is no cautionary tale or imagined dystopia. This was life for millions during the medieval era, a time when young lives were not treasured but treated as tools. The medieval world was already cruel for adults, but for children, it was nothing short of a nightmare. In an age ruled by hunger, disease, and endless uncertainty, it was the youngest who bore the heaviest cost. When famine loomed, they were the first to go hungry. When minds needed bodies, theirs were sent. When harvests failed, they were offered to the fields. Today we think of child labor as a shameful relic of the past. But in medieval Europe, it was the way of life. 4- and 5-year-olds were expected to work just like their elders. Water from deep wells with arms too weak to lift it. Herding animals across frozen land with bare feet and threadbare clothes. Crawling into dark tunnels where cave-ins waited and the sun never reached. Nobles and priests might speak of innocence in gilded halls. But for most children, that idea was a fantasy. From their first steps, children were burdened with labor, pushed to the edge of physical endurance, their spirits worn thin by endless demands. But this story is about more than just poverty. It's about a system. A world that convinced itself that children were worth less, that their pain was necessary. It's the story of how entire societies can justify cruelty by calling it normal. Tonight, we open the door to that world. We'll walk through smoke-filled workshops where 6-year-olds labored under threat of injury. We'll step into the black mines lit only by candlelight, where dust settled into young lungs like poison. We'll witness the pain of families forced to sell their children, not from malice but desperation. This is not an easy story to hear. It is a testament to the strength of the smallest shoulders. But it is also a mirror showing what happens when a world forgets that children are not tools. In the silence of tonight, we will become the voices they never had. We will remember them. We'll speak for them. So prepare yourself for a descent into one of history's darkest corners. What you're about to learn may anger you, sadden you, and change how you see the past. But it will also remind you of how far we've come, and how far we must still go to ensure it never happens again. They told themselves comforting lies. That allowing children to serve was noble. That toil gave young lives purpose. That hardship built character. These weren't just whispered excuses. They were widely believed truths, even medieval medical texts joined in. They claimed that a child's spine was flexible, perfect for squeezing through narrow tunnels. That children's lungs were stronger than adults, better suited to breathing in dust and cold air. This wasn't fringe thinking. It was accepted science. Society had convinced itself that children were not only meant for suffering, but that their suffering made them ideal workers. Even the apprenticeship system, often romanticized as a sign of care, was, in truth, another layer of exploitation. Children, sometimes as young as 7, were legally bound to a master for 7 to 14 years. During that time, they had no rights. They could be beaten, overworked, and starved, and they had no one to turn to. These apprenticeships were not opportunities. They were lifelong sentences. A runaway child could be pursued like lost property. If they died in service, there was no inquiry. No justice. It was simply the cost of labor. But this system didn't just break bodies. It broke spirits. Apprentices were pulled from their families, placed in unfamiliar homes where warmth and affection were rare. They were told they were worthless, that their only value was in how much work they could do. Even the food they received was framed as something they didn't deserve. Psychological control was as precise as physical punishment. Masters pitted children against one another, rewarding loyalty and obedience with slightly better scraps, using fear to prevent rebellion. Children were taught to distrust each other, to inform on each other. It was a system built on isolation. Court records from the time are littered with stories of children who vanished. A mill apprentice who stopped showing up, Smith's helper, who was there one week, gone the next. A servant girl who simply disappeared. These weren't mysteries. They were quiet tragedies no one questioned. Children worked to death, beaten when they slowed down, or simply allowed to waste away from neglect, and no one dared speak the truth aloud. And the saddest part, this mindset wasn't confined to the elite. Even struggling peasants viewed children as labor first, family second. A newborn wasn't welcomed with joy, it was tallied as future help. Another pair of hands. Another mouth to feed, yes, but also a future source of income or insurance for old age. From their first steps, children were told their worth lay in their productivity. A child who could lift more, endure more, was praised. A child who couldn't was a problem, a liability. Wills from the era reflect this chilling mindset. If a child was sickly, lazy, or disobedient, they could be disinherited, cast out, left to fend for themselves, but the deepest wound cut through the very idea of love. Even parents who cared deeply had to make impossible choices. Sometimes sending a child to harsh labor was the only way the rest of the family could survive. Love became a thing measured in sacrifice. A mother might cradle her child one final time before sending them off to serve in the Lord's manor, knowing full well she may never see them again. A father might teach his son to mask pain, not from cruelty, but because he knew weakness could get him killed. Survival demanded silence. The few glimpses we get from children themselves are unbearable. Those rare fragments of letters or records show how deeply the system reshaped their sense of self. They didn't believe their suffering was wrong. They believed it was earned, deserved, expected. Their short lives were filled with pain, and they thought that pain was normal. That's the greatest tragedy, not just the suffering, but the way it erased their sense of worth, and this didn't happen in secret. This cruelty wasn't hidden in dark corners. It unfolded in broad daylight. The manor house, the village square, the church. People walked past exhausted children every day lying in doorways, slumped by wells, curled under carts. Priests preached sermons while children scrubbed floors until their hands cracked. Merchants counted their profits, while in cellars beneath them, children worked those profits into being. This wasn't a rogue injustice. It was the backbone of society. The truth is brutal. The comfort of the few was built on the pain of the many, and the ones who suffered most were always the smallest, weakest, and least able to defend themselves. As we continue this journey into the forgotten suffering of medieval children, we must remember this is not just a relic of the past. This is a mirror held to the darkest parts of human nature. These atrocities were not committed by monsters, but by people like us people, who thought they were doing what needed to be done. The children of that age had no protection, no power, no voice. But here, centuries later, we can give them something. We can remember. We can tell their story. And in doing so, we ensure that their voices long silenced are finally heard. When most people imagine medieval childhood, they picture something simple. Boys training as apprentices, girls picking flowers in castle gardens. But the truth, buried beneath romantic images and fairy tales, is something else entirely. Behind the soft colors lies a brutal system of exploitation. The kind that didn't just fail. Children, it consumed them. This was not accidental. Child labor wasn't a sad necessity. It was the very engine of society. The wealth of the elite was built on the backs of children. Their small bodies, ideal for tight places and fine work, were used up without remorse. This is no tale of chimney sweeps or humble field hands. This is about how an entire civilization chose to profit from suffering. They called it virtue. Those 6-year-olds lost in mines didn't wander there. The girls bleeding at spinning wheels weren't unlucky. The boys dying on cathedral scaffolds weren't unfortunate. They were selected, used, and discarded. And the scariest part? It was all considered normal. No one protested. Leaders justified it. Doctors rationalized it. Priests sanctified it. The legal system protected those who exploited children, ignored the children themselves. But the greatest loss wasn't just health or safety. It was identity. Childhood, in its truest sense, was stolen. A 7-year-old could be bound to 20 years of labor. A child's death in service meant less than the loss of a plow horse. Childhood as we know it simply did not exist for most. The stories we're about to explore next aren't just footnotes. They're warnings. These are the cries of children whom history tried to silence because their pain was seen as too common to matter. But those cries echo still, asking us to listen. As we go deeper into this story, we'll uncover how this cruelty was woven into every structure: religion, economy, law. We'll see how generations of children were trapped in a nightmare with no exit. We'll come to understand how easy it is to forget the powerless when power writes the records. They had no protectors, no champions. They lived and died in the dark. But tonight, they are not forgotten. We tell their story now because only by facing this history can we make sure it never returns. Even as the church, clan leaders, noble lords wrung every drop of labor from young lives, a deeper and more disturbing reality remained largely unspoken. What we've discussed so far, the grinding work, the hunger, the punishments, was just the surface. Beneath it was a more calculated truth. Medieval society didn't just accept child labor as unavoidable. Deliberately engineered systems to erase the very concept of childhood, reducing it to a fleeting moment before a lifetime of servitude began. Today, we might imagine medieval childhood through softened lenses, young apprentices learning meaningful trades, farm children helping with the harvest in the golden light of autumn. These visions suggest a kind of rough virtue, a path toward self-reliance. But this romanticized view erases the intentional cruelty built into the foundations of that world. What really existed was a machine, one carefully designed to consume young lives, and every law, every custom, and every institution helped keep that machine running. Let's look closer. In the sprawling monasteries that dotted the medieval landscape, children as young as 6 were handed over as a blatesnot, as a gift to God. But as a desperate attempt by struggling families to ease their burden, these weren't holy offerings. They were sacrifices. And once those monastery doors shut behind them, these children stepped into a world that would strip away their youth day by day, prayer by prayer. The monastic rules were relentless. Oblate children were expected to rise at midnight for the first service of the day. Yes, midnight, while their bodies were still developing. They were dragged from what little rest they got to kneel for hours on stone floors in cold chapels, their knees bruised, their backs aching. They prayed in silence before stumbling back to their pallets for a few more hours of sleep. If they were lucky, before dawn, prayers began. After that came meager food, thin porridge barely enough to nourish a growing body. Then the day truly began. These children spent their waking hours copying texts in cold scriptoriums, where a single ink blot could result in harsh punishment. They tended the monastery's livestock, cleaned the grounds, cooked meals, and maintained the buildings. Of this was presented as holy work that their pain was sacred, their hardship a path to spiritual enlightenment. But here's the part that turns discipline into something far darker. Surviving records from these institutions show that monasteries calculated how little sleep, food, and rest a child could endure while still remaining functional. They measured suffering. They tested thresholds. They knew exactly how much they could demand from a young body before it failed, and they made sure to stay just below that line. The goal wasn't kindness, it was efficiency. When these children inevitably fell ill, when malnutrition and exhaustion caught up with them, the monastery's solution wasn't healing. It was replacement. Were cast out, left, to perish quietly. Fresh ones were brought in. Monastery ledgers listed these young souls like livestock tracked, tallied, and discarded as needed. You might think the secular world offered some measure of safety. But outside the monastery walls, life could be even harsher. At least the church cloaked its exploitation in the language of salvation. Feudal lords didn't bother with spiritual excuses. They saw children as tools, smaller, more flexible versions of adults, and that's where one of the most chilling inventions of the era comes into focus. Child-specific jobs. These weren't roles where children helped parents in the fields. These were tasks deliberately created because children were small, expendable, and unlikely to resist. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the growing mining industry. Beneath the earth, in tunnels too narrow for adults to navigate, children as young as 5 were sent to crawl through choking darkness. Their job? Haul carts of ore and coal through passages barely wider than their own bodies. Their backs bent, their knees scraped raw. They dragged heavy loads while breathing air thick with dust and dangerous fumes. The industry had realized something horrifying. Children's size gave them access to resources others couldn't reach. So, mining systems were built around exploiting that fact. These children lived in perpetual darkness. They entered the mines before sunrise and emerged long after nightfall. For some days, or even weeks passed without seeing the sky. They developed a pale, ashen complexion, so distinct that people outside the mines could recognize a mine child on sight. But the damage went far beyond their skin. Constant malnutrition and physical strain stunted their growth. Years of crawling through tunnels curved their spines permanently. Many grew up twisted, their bodies locked in the hunched shapes they were forced to endure. And perhaps the most heartbreaking detail of all, these children often lost the ability to play. Witnesses wrote that even when given time to rest, they didn't run, laugh, or imagine. They simply sat, silent and distant. Their minds, worn thin by fear and exhaustion, couldn't access joy anymore. This wasn't just physical destruction. It was emotional erasure. Medieval society had, in every sense, beaten the childhood out of them. But the mines weren't the only places where the exploitation of the young had been carefully engineered. In the textile mills that began rising across Europe, children were prized not for their potential, but for their size. Their small hands, their quick reflexes, their ability to crawl under heavy looms made them indispensable. What began as simple assistance quickly became full-scale labor. These mills operated on exhausting schedules that even grown men would find punishing. The work began before dawn and continued well past nightfall, with only short breaks for modest meals. Children worked in constant motion under threat of reprimand, and the machines they served were merciless. Fingers were crushed in gears, hands mutilated by shuttles, hair caught in spools, clothing snagged by belts. Mill owners didn't just expect these accidents, they anticipated them, budgeted for them, and ensured there were always more children ready to replace the ones who were lost. But what made this even more chilling was how deeply the law supported it. Under the system of villanage, not only were adults bound to the land, they passed that bondage down to their children. Legal provisions made it clear, from the moment a child drew breath, their labor belonged to their lord. This wasn't a temporary arrangement. There was no escape clause, no buyout, no coming of age. These children were property owned, managed, and spent like currency. And while one might hope the church would have stood against this treatment, offering sanctuary or resistance, it instead provided spiritual cover. Church doctrine declared, children sinful from birth, in need of cleansing through suffering. Hard labor wasn't exploitation. Priests preached that complaints were rebellion against God, that hardship was the righteous path to heaven. The message was simple and brutal. To suffer was to be sanctified. This theological reasoning turned ordinary parents into agents of the system. They were told that allowing their children to struggle was an act of love, that shielding them from work was spiritually harmful. The church had done more than permit child labor, it had redefined it as a moral good. It had turned protection into neglect and sacrifice into duty. But the most insidious part of all this wasn't what was done to the children. It was what was done inside them. From the moment they could speak, these children were taught that work was their only purpose, that their value came not from who they were, but from what they could endure. Rest was laziness. Play was sinful. Pain was proof of worth. So even when no one forced them to keep going, many did, driven not by fear of punishment, but by a belief that their very identity depended on it. They didn't need chains. They had been trained to wear their suffering, like a badge of honor. This is what made the medieval treatment of children so uniquely cruel. It wasn't just that they were overworked. It was that the entire culture had been shaped to erase the idea of childhood itself. Every institution, from the church to the manor, the guild to the court, agreed children existed to serve. Their comfort, their joy, their future, none of that mattered compared to the demands of the adults who owned them. And tragically, the system sustained itself across generations. Those who survived became the next enforcers. It's not out of malice, but because they had been taught it was right, because they knew no other way, because they truly believed that this was how society should function. Cruelty had become tradition. Suffering had become inheritance. And so the cycle continued with no clear end in sight. As we peel back the layers of this dark era, we must remember that we are not simply studying outdated labor policies or forgotten economies. We are examining a profound betrayal. A civilization that turned its back on its most vulnerable and in doing so lost part of its own soul. Generations of children were not merely exploited. They were erased from the story of what it meant to be human. They weren't just workers. They were casualties of a silent war, a war waged not with swords or fire, but with neglect, indifference, and the relentless pressure of impossible expectations. This was not survival, it was sacrifice. Those sacrificed were the smallest, the weakest, the most in need of protection. The morning air, it's often filled with the sounds of life and labor, also carried the echoes of something far more haunting. It was not celebration. It was not joy. It was the cries of children who had never known what it meant to be safe, who never tasted kindness without obligation. These weren't the cherished little ones we imagined sheltered, cared for, and taught with love. They were instead viewed as miniature adult stools to be sharpened, used, and eventually discarded. By the time a child reached 5 or 6, their place in the world was already set. By the time most medieval children reached 5 or 6, whatever trace of innocence or wonder remained had been stripped away. Their days began long before the sun rose, not with laughter or learning, but with grueling labor that would exhaust even a grown man. In the textile mills that spread across the countryside, young hands operated complex looms with numbing repetition, not because they wanted to, but because survival demanded it. The air in these crowded workshops was a choking blend of lint, dust, and oil. The noise from the looms was deafening, silencing complaints, stifling cries. These weren't hopeful apprentices learning a trade. They were commodities. Many of them were handed over through binding agreements their parents signed out of desperation, trading years of their child's life for a few coins or sacks of grain. The children had no choice. Their futures were decided before they even understood the words being spoken. The hours were brutal, stretching from first light until deep into the night, often 14 to 15 hours, with barely time to eat. The machines they worked were large and dangerous, offering no protection for the small bodies that served them. Accidents were frequent and often fatal. A hand caught in a spinning spindle, foot crushed beneath a falling beam. A child's cry met not with compassion, but with replacement. There were no safety nets, no healing hands. If a child was injured, they were removed and replaced, no questions asked. And yet the wounds that didn't bleed were sometimes the deepest. The psychological burden of this existence was immeasurable. From the earliest moments of awareness, these children were taught that their only worth came from their output. Productivity equaled value. Love and care were distant dreams. Parents, too broken by their own daily grind, often had little emotional strength left to comfort their suffering children. Affection gave way to survival. Hugs were replaced by hurried instructions. Lullabies by orders shouted over roaring machines. Even within the home where a child might hope for sanctuary, economic pressure poisoned the bonds of family. Food was scarce. Emotions were strained. Security was fleeting. In the mines, a different kind of horror awaited. Children as young as 7 squeezed through tunnels no adult could enter. Their small size, instead of being protected, was exploited. They hauled heavy carts of coal or through pitch-black corridors, their backs permanently warped by the strain. The dust filled their lungs with every breath. The walls threatened to collapse. Poisonous gases crept silently. Death came quietly. And often, the fields were no safer. In the agricultural economy, no one was spared. Children planted and harvested alongside their elders. They bent over rows of crops for hours, calloused fingers grasping tools far too heavy for their age. Even toddlers were expected to help chasing stray chickens, gathering spilled grain, dragging feed to livestock, and during harvest, when every hand was needed, age or strength didn't matter. If you could stand, you could work. What made this all the more tragic was that it wasn't considered tragic at all. Medieval culture justified this treatment at every turn. Religious teachings shaped much of that justification. The church taught that children were born with sin in their hearts, that labor purified them. Suffering was not cruelty, it was divine correction. And so hard work was seen not as oppression, but as moral development. The legal system only reinforced this mindset. Children had no independent rights. They could not speak against their fathers or their masters or the conditions they were subjected to. If hurt, they had no means to demand justice. If overworked, they had no one to turn to. They were seen as extensions of their parents owned, managed, and traded accordingly. Medical understanding of childhood was woefully lacking. Children were seen as incomplete adults. Their physical and emotional needs were ignored. 6-year-old was expected to focus like a laborer, work like one, and endure pain without complaint. When they failed, the response wasn't sympathy, it was punishment. Physical discipline was common and often severe. It wasn't seen as abuse. It was seen as instruction. Education, the one potential path out of this cycle, was reserved for the privileged few. Nobles' sons learned to read. Merchant families might pay for tutors, but for the vast majority, literacy was a dream they would never approach. Instead of holding quills, they held shovels. Instead of learning letters, they learned how to obey. Their minds were left fallow, untrained, and unvalued. And that wasn't an accident, it was by design. Child who could read might question. Child who could reason might resist. And so the system kept them ignorant, ensuring they would follow the same path as their parents. With no chance of stepping outside it, even within their own homes, these children stood at the bottom of the family hierarchy. They ate last. Often, they ate least whatever scraps remained after the adults were fed. Their clothes were passed down until they disintegrated, patched and stitched until nothing remained. They slept in corners of overcrowded cottages, curled on straw that was rarely clean. Fleas and lice were constant companions. Illness was just a fact of life. And doctors, for those who could afford them, rarely visited homes like these. By the time a child in medieval Europe reached age 7, what we think of as childhood had already ended if it had ever existed at all. Their day did not begin with warmth, comfort, or curiosity. It began with orders shouted in the dark. No gentle words or nourishing meals greeted them. Only the cold bite of morning air and the knowledge that failure to act quickly would mean punishment. There was no school bell, no chance to learn for the sake of learning. There was only work backbreaking, dangerous, relentless. The tiny hands of these children were already marked with cuts, bruises, and hardened calluses. Their fingers knew more about labor than play. Their eyes, dulled by fatigue, rarely looked upward in wonder. They were taught to look down, to obey, to endure. In the monastery schools, often thought of as havens of learning conditions, were just as harsh. Children sent to these religious institutions were expected to work nearly as much as they studied. Their responsibilities included maintaining the buildings, copying texts for hours in freezing rooms, and performing grueling chores without rest. Punishment for mistakes was swift and physical. A missed word in a manuscript could lead to bruises, spilled ink, to time spent kneeling on stone floors in silent pain. And these were the children considered lucky. Outside monastery walls, the situation was even grimmer. Almost half of all children died before reaching age 5. Those who survived infancy faced hunger, untreated illness, and frequent injury. The toll of poverty, labor, and violence left. Many physically aged before they ever became teenagers. Playfulness, creativity, and curiosity, things that should define youth, were slowly beaten out of them. A child who asked questions risked reprimand. A child who laughed too loudly might draw punishment. Expressing emotion was a liability in a world that viewed childhood as a resource, not a phase to protect. Emotional development suffered under these pressures. Most children were never shown the affection or security needed to grow into healthy, empathetic adults. Love was a luxury for the wealthy. For poor children, survival took precedence. Their emotional needs were invisible, unspoken, unmet. And for girls, the burden was even heavier. They endured the same physical demands as boys, but with the added weight of systemic discrimination. In many families, daughters were considered expendable. When resources ran low, girls were often the first to be sent away into servitude, into arranged marriages, or into environments rife with exploitation. They were offered less food, fewer protections, and even fewer chances at education. Their contributions were undervalued, and their suffering was ignored. Abuse, especially gender-based, was tragically common, but justice was rare. Few authorities considered the mistreatment of girls worth addressing. Many acts of cruelty went unpunished, their victims silenced by fear or shame. The idea that a child might deserve autonomy or protection had no legal standing. They were seen not as individuals, but as family property. The apprenticeship system is often portrayed today as a noble tradition. Children learning trades under wise mentors. But in truth, it was another structure of control. Children, some as young as 8, were legally bound to their masters for years, often without pay. They lived under strict rules and endured exhausting work under harsh conditions. Many never survived long enough to benefit from their supposed training. They were pushed to the brink, used up before their promise could bloom. The trauma inflicted during these years had a ripple effect. Children who had never known love, kindness, or rest often became adults who didn't know how to offer it to others. They passed on what they had been taught, that pain was necessary, that obedience was survival, and that children must be hardened, not protected. And so, generation after generation, the cycle continued, anchored by fear, reinforced by law, and justified by religion. Every institution in medieval society contributed to this system. The church wrapped suffering in spiritual language. The legal system stripped children of agency. Families desperate to survive were forced to send their children into harm's way. There was no one to speak for the voiceless, no advocates, no protections, just silence and labor. The result was a society where compassion had withered, where kindness was weakness, and where the powerful thrived on the backs of the vulnerable. Childhood became a phase to be endured, not cherished. And children became workers before they had the chance to be human beings. But as we look back, it's essential we remember, these were not faceless statistics. These were real children, boys and girls who once laughed, dreamed, and hoped, who deserved safety, education, and love, were denied all of it. Their lives were shaped not by fate, but by choices made by adults who valued wealth over welfare, production over protection, and power over empathy. The damage done to them did not end with their short lives. It echoed across generations, leaving behind scars that shaped history. These children, whose names we will never know, are not lost to time. We remember them not to dwell in guilt, but to understand how easily cruelty can be normalized and how vital it is to protect the most vulnerable among us. Their stories matter. Their suffering demands acknowledgement. And their stolen childhoods must never be forgotten. Even virtuous, that it was God's plan, that suffering purified the soul, that hard work built character. But in truth, it wasn't divine design. It was a human system, a brutal machine of control, extraction, and denial carefully crafted to crush children's bodies, minds, and spirits in the service of adult convenience and profit. Medieval society didn't just fail. Children had betrayed them at every level. The most tragic part wasn't only the pain, but the normalization of that pain. Adults saw nothing wrong with it. Parents, priests, lords, teachers, all believed or convinced themselves that they were doing what was necessary, that children were too wild, too sinful, too unformed to be left alone, that labor and discipline were what would make them into useful people. But in truth, this wasn't discipline. It was indoctrination, it was abuse. And it started from the moment a child could walk, instead of shaping children into thoughtful, compassionate, capable adults. The system ground them into obedience and silence. It didn't prepare them for life, it conditioned them to endure it. Not to live, but to survive. Not to dream, but to obey. And that obedience was total. It reached into every corner of their lives. Their time wasn't their own. Their bodies weren't their own. Even their thoughts were patrolled by fear and shame. The stories of those who tried to resist, those who ran away, who dared to cry, who refused to work are few. Not because such children didn't exist, but because their stories often ended. In silence, many were beaten until they stopped resisting. Others simply disappeared, cast out, starved, or killed. There were no records, no markers, no gravestones, just absence. And this silence, the way history has ignored their sufferings, itself a continuation of the abuse. For centuries, we've romanticized the past, turning medieval childhood into fairy tales and noble apprenticeships. We imagine young squires learning to wield swords or peasant children frolicking in meadows. But for the vast majority, childhood was not a storybook. It was a sentence. They weren't raised, they were used. Their potential was never realized because it was never allowed to grow. Their joy was taken, their health was taken. Their lives were taken, not always through death, but through a slow erosion of self that left them hollow, submissive, broken. This isn't to say there were no moments of light. Even in the darkest places, children found ways to resist, to dream, to love. A stolen moment of laughter. A whispered story passed between friends. A song hummed under the breath. These moments mattered. They were acts of rebellion in a world that tried to make children forget they were human. But the fact that even these flickers of joy were dangerous tells us everything we need to know about how cruel and unnatural the system was. Medieval child labor wasn't just a failure of empathy. It was a deliberate campaign against the very concept of childhood. A system so complete, so pervasive, that for hundreds of years no one thought to question it. No one dared to imagine another way. And when we ask why did this happen? Why was it allowed? We must look inward. Because the machinery of exploitation is an ancient history. It's a human impulse to justify cruelty, to silence the weak, to believe that if something is normal, it must also be right. But normal is not the same as moral, and silence is not the same as peace. The children of the medieval world were not born to serve. They were not created to be broken. They were not lesser versions of adults. They were children full of potential, emotion, creativity, and light. And what was done to them wasn't just a tragedy, it was a theft of lives, of futures, of everything that makes life worth living. As we reflect on these stories, not myths, not metaphors, but real lives, we carry a responsibility. Not just to feel sorrow, but to remember. Not just to condemn the past, but to recognize its echoes in our present, because while the tools may have changed, the dynamics of power and exploitation remain all too familiar. If we forget what happened to these children, if we allow their pain to fade into academic abstraction or nostalgic fiction, we risk allowing the same patterns to repeat. So let us remember them, not as victims, but as stolen children. Let us speak their names, even if history did not record them. Let us hold space for the laughter they never had, for the games they never played for, the dreams they never got to chase. Let us honor them by telling the truth. The systematic exploitation of children during medieval times did not stop at the fields or the workshops. It reached deep into the very institutions that claimed to safeguard innocence and speak for divine justice. And at the heart of this moral betrayal stood the Church, the supposed bastion of compassion and virtue, which not only participated in, but perfected the machinery of child exploitation. Behind the cloistered walls of monastery schools and cathedral workshops, the Church concealed a cruel and calculated system of labor. These were not places of refuge or education. They were labor camps, cloaked in sanctity. Children as young as 4 were handed over by desperate parents, not as students, but as oblates offerings. And though their families were told this was a path to salvation, in truth, it was a slow descent into spiritual and physical ruin. These children were stripped of everything: their family, their language, their culture. They were forbidden from speaking their native tongues, beaten into silence for crying, and expected to memorize liturgical Latin texts they couldn't possibly understand. In frigid scriptoriums, their tiny fingers cracked and bled as they copied manuscripts by candlelight. Their tears were dismissed. Their suffering was ritualized. This wasn't salvation. It was systematic annihilation of the spirit. Monks who claimed to be saving souls dined on roasted meats and rich wines, while child oblates subsisted on thin gruel and stale crusts. The Church grew fat on tithes and tributes, much of it earned through the blood and toil of children who owned nothing, not even the clothes on their backs. These children slept on damp straw, rose before sunrise for hours of prayer they didn't comprehend, and labored from morning to night, scrubbing floors, preparing meals, mending robes, and copying sacred texts under threat of the rod. Yet the horrors extended beyond the monastery gates. At cathedral construction sites hailed today as triumphs of Gothic architecture, children were forced to haul stones, mix mortars, and climb rickety scaffolding. Their small, underdeveloped bodies were contorted by loads they should never have carried. Many fell. Many died. None were remembered. The towering arches and soaring spires that still draw tourists today were built on the shattered bones of anonymous children. And worse still, the Church mutilated some children in the name of beauty. Boys were castrated to preserve their high voices for cathedral choirs, their futures sacrificed to create perfect harmonies for noble patrons. Girls were forced into convents, not as a matter of faith, but of social disposal, their lives confined to endless cleaning, prayer, and obedience. Their vows were not chosen. They were imposed, branded into them by poverty and powerlessness. What made this exploitation particularly perverse was the spiritual framework that justified it. All parents were told that giving their children to the Church was the ultimate act of faith. Children were taught that their pain was holy, that every bruise, every blister, every sleepless night brought them closer to God. And this was the cruelest lie of all, one that turned victims into participants and made gratitude a condition of their suffering. Church physicians, echoing the pseudoscience of the time, insisted that children's bodies were better suited for labor than adults, that hardship made them stronger, that physical pain built moral character. These claims gave the Church license to push children beyond their limits and work them literally to death, under the guise of divine favor. This system of religious child labor was not isolated. It was a network of institutionalized abuse, spanning every major monastery, cathedral, and religious house across Europe. Thousands of children, likely tens of thousands, were consumed by it. The Church recorded their deaths with the same indifference it used to tally livestock. A line in a ledger, a number, a nameless, voiceless offering. Those who tried to flee were hunted down, beaten, branded, sometimes killed and dumped in unmarked graves. No funerals, no prayers, justice, and the ones who survived. They carried the trauma into adulthood like a second skin. Many became angry, violent, withdrawn. Others turned to drink or passed the abuse down to their own children. The damage did not end with them. It reverberated across generations, affecting every layer of society with the psychological legacy of domination and despair. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all this wasn't the abuse itself, but the way it was celebrated. Wealthy nobles donated to these holy institutions, proud to fund child labor in the name of charity. Kings competed to sponsor cathedral projects staffed by children. This wasn't a shameful secret, it was a moral badge of honor, sign of devotion. An act of prestige, it reveals something devastating, that medieval society did not just tolerate child abuse. It glorified it, wove it into the very fabric of its moral and spiritual identity. The Church's betrayal of children is not just a historical crime. It is a profound indictment of power unmoored from empathy, of how easily language, ritual, and belief can be weaponized to justify the unthinkable. The exploitation of children was not an unfortunate byproduct of poverty. It was a deliberate, calculated system, engineered to extract maximum labor from the smallest and most vulnerable members of society, all while proclaiming divine righteousness. And the worst part, it worked. The system sustained itself for centuries, unchallenged and uninterrupted, creating a world where even the idea of childhood was erased, replaced by servitude, submission, and silence. The brutal truths we've uncovered so far paint a bleak picture of medieval childhood. But if there is one industry that perhaps most perfectly encapsulates the cold efficiency of systemic child exploitation in the Middle Ages, it is the wool trade. This was not a fringe enterprise. The wool industry was the economic engine of medieval Europe, and it ran on the backs of children. Across England, Flanders, and the textile centers of France and Italy, massive cloth halls rose like stone prisons above the cityscape. Inside them, hundreds of children labored day and night, unseen, unheard, and largely forgotten. Children as young as 6 were snatched from their homes by merchants who traveled to rural villages offering small payments to desperate families. Many parents, starving and hopeless, handed over their sons and daughters believing, or hoping, that they might find food, shelter, or a future. What they gave them instead was a sentence. The recruitment process was less invitation and more systematic kidnapping. Sanitized by paperwork no parent could read, contracts written in Latin that sold away a child's life for 7 years. Sometimes more. These agreements, always weighted in favor of the employer, had clauses so vague and punitive that minor infractions could add years to a child's term. Childhood in this system became a debt that could never be repaid. Inside, the workshops, the organization of labor mirrored a grotesque parody of age-based development. The smallest children, those between 5 and 7, were assigned to crawl beneath the looms, tight spaces where adults could not fit. Their job was to retrieve fallen threads and fix breaks, all while massive wooden mechanisms slammed inches above their heads. They spent 12 to 14 hours a day hunched in filth and fiber, breathing in dust so thick it coated their lungs and stained their teeth gray. Older children graduated to spinning, their hands stained by dyes and raw wool, locked into repetitive tasks. So exacting, they began to develop permanent disfigurements. Fingers curled into claws, joints swelled with pain. By age 10, many were already partially disabled. The eldest children operated the looms themselves, working under constant threat of violence. Overseers walked the rows with leather whips and wooden rods, punishing slow work or misaligned threads. With savage beatings, no allowance was made for fatigue. Hunger was a motivator, and fear the primary tool of instruction, and all of it was legal. Medieval law treated children not as people, but as property, extensions of their parents who could be sold into contracts for years at a time. No consent was needed. No understanding was expected. The very notion of children having rights would not emerge for centuries. But the cruelty wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Children were stripped of their names, replaced with numbers. They were told again and again that they had been abandoned, that their families didn't want them, that the workshop was their home now, and the master their new father. In a sick twist, those who broke quickest were rewarded. Owners learned to manipulate the children's desperate need for love and approval. Some were singled out for special treatment, extra food, a kind word, and then turned into informants, enforcers, abusers themselves. This wasn't just exploitation. It was indoctrination. Stockholm Syndrome weaponized for industrial profit, and then came the dye houses, perhaps the most nightmarish part of the process. Children were made to stir boiling vats of chemicals. With their bare hands, the fumes from mercury and lead dyes burned their lungs, damaged their nervous systems, and caused hallucinations and tremors. The most vibrant colors, the purples, reds, and blues worn by nobles and bishops, came at the cost of poisoned blood and scorched skin. Many children never lived long enough to finish their contracts. Others emerged permanently deformed. Hunched backs, crooked limbs, damaged eyes, respiratory failure. The medical consequences were lifelong. But treatment was not an option, unless it was to patch them up just enough to get them back to work. And when the day ended, if it ever really did, the children were crammed into wooden sleeping shelves stacked 3 high like cargo, each space barely larger than a coffin. There was no privacy, no warmth, no protection. They slept in shifts because the machines never stopped. And neither did the need for tiny, broken hands to keep them running. Even food, if you could call it that, was part of the control system. Just enough to survive. Never enough to grow strong, moldy bread, spoiled grain, dirty water that carried disease. Starvation was used as punishment and meals as bribes. Disobedience came with consequences beyond hunger. Some children were whipped, others had their hands bound while still being made to work. The most terrifying punishment of all was the sack being sewn into a wool bag and hung from the rafters. Left to choke in total darkness as fibers filled their lungs and fear consumed their minds. And while all this happened, institutions of the day stood not only as silent witnesses, but as active participants. The church, that great moral authority, owned many of these textile workshops. Monasteries operated them to produce vestments, banners, and tapestries. Priests tracked the output of child laborers like cattle, praising high performers in their records and casually noting the deaths of others. Noble families, fully aware of these conditions, wore their finery proudly. Some would visit workshops to select children personally, admiring the craftsmanship of their suffering. A few even commissioned specific children to labor exclusively for their wardrobes. Their entire existence reduced to satisfying the vanity of one powerful adult. The guilds, which claimed to protect worker rights, did nothing to stop it. In fact, they defended the practice, arguing that child labor was essential to industry. That apprenticeships, many of which were just forced servitude, were noble traditions. It all paints a picture not of a few bad actors, but of a civilization in which every major institution was complicit in the destruction of childhood, religion, government, industry, family, all conspired, whether actively or passively, to turn children to tools, not people, tools. And as we move forward in this investigation, we must ask the difficult questions. How did this mindset persist? How did a society not only accept such cruelty, but build its entire economic and moral framework around it? The wool industry didn't just create garments. It wove a culture of normalized suffering, one thread at a time. Medieval guild systems introduced age rules that guaranteed a steady influx of inexpensive labor. Specific types of tasks were designated solely for children, embedding their exploitation within the framework of so-called traditional craftsmanship. Workshop masters were obligated to maintain a set ratio of children to adult workers, with the earnings of these young laborers redirected not to them or their families, but to the guild leaders. Most disturbing was how medieval society rationalized this cruelty, twisting religious teachings into a justification. Clergy often preached that childhood suffering had spiritual value, that enduring hardship would teach humility and prepare young souls for salvation. They referenced scripture praising hard work, while conveniently overlooking passages emphasizing compassion, protection of the innocent, and care for the weak. This theological endorsement gave a moral shield to those profiting from child labor, allowing them to present exploitation as righteous guidance. But the consequences stretched far beyond the workshop walls. Those children who lived through their years of forced service often emerged as deeply damaged adults, both physically and mentally. Many bore lifelong injuries and emotional trauma. Trusting others became nearly impossible as their earliest memories were dominated by adults who viewed them only as tools to be used. Tragically, some perpetuated the cycle themselves, taking on roles as overseers and repeating the same abuses they had suffered. Economically, the impact was staggering. Child labor generated massive profits for workshop owners, even as the children remained trapped in poverty. Records from major textile hubs reveal that goods produced by child workers brought in returns far exceeding their minimal upkeep. These enormous profit margins fueled the rise of influential merchant houses and funded the extravagant lifestyles of the medieval elite. All of it rested on the backs of suffering children. Even the medical field, limited as it was, played a role. Physicians of the time created theories claiming that children were more resilient than adults, that labor would strengthen them, and that their pain was beneficial to growth. These pseudoscientific beliefs added yet another layer of legitimacy to a system that, by modern standards, can only be described as institutionalized cruelty. Stripped of their individuality, many children in medieval religious institutions were renamed with numbers or scriptural titles, erasing their pasts to mold them into instruments of obedience. Their memories and personal identities were overwritten. By narratives crafted to serve the institution, questioning authority was labeled sinful. Showing pain meant weakness. Even the desire for freedom was painted as a sign of moral decay. In the scriptoria, young scribes worked tirelessly over sacred text, often hunched for 18 hours a day, their spines deforming with each passing month under freezing stone roofs. Their ink-stained fingers moved numbly, cut and raw from parchment edges while their minds dulled themselves to endure the monotony. One mistake could bring harsh discipline. Signs of fatigue led to extended fasting. Emotional reactions were punished with isolation in cramped stone cells, barely fit for human occupancy. The monastery kitchens told a similar story. Children labored over hot flames and steaming pots, their arms marked by burns and scalds. Heavy cauldrons strained their underdeveloped bodies. Smoke-filled air choked their lungs, while sharp tools caused frequent injuries. There was no room for error, and perfection was not praised. It was demanded. In the monastery gardens and fields, children toiled beneath sun and rain alike, their small frames burdened with loads meant for adults. These outdoor tasks were framed as agricultural instruction, yet the reality resembled forced labor. Overseers viewed them as replaceable parts, not growing individuals. What made this exploitation even more insidious was how it was portrayed. Parents were assured that their children were receiving elite education, religious instruction, and moral guidance. In truth, these institutions were creating generations of deeply traumatized youth, taught to equate pain with virtue and submission with holiness. They were conditioned to suppress natural instincts for joy and self-preservation, replacing them with an obsession for approval earned through suffering. The psychological tactics used in these institutions were deliberate. Children were told their physical bodies were impure and required punishment. They were led to confess imagined sins and beg forgiveness for wrongs they had never committed. Many even competed to demonstrate who could endure more discomfort, believing that divine favor could be earned through hardship. Nights were broken by mandatory prayer sessions that interrupted sleep, creating constant fatigue. This exhaustion made resistance difficult. Malnourished and sleep-deprived, their developing minds suffered long-term harm. Emotional growth stalled, and basic cognitive development was often impaired. Among the darkest elements was the use of religious rhetoric to justify boundary violations. Children were told that their bodies did not belong to them, that their role was to serve spiritual leaders in every way, which sometimes led to deeply inappropriate encounters cloaked in dogma. The confusion and trauma were worsened by convincing the victims that they were complicit, that they had failed spiritually or worse, Speaking out would jeopardize their salvation. Medical care, already primitive, was often withheld on moral grounds. Illness was explained as divine punishment for spiritual weakness. Instead of treatment, children were encouraged to endure pain as a test of faith. Conditions easily managed by even the limited knowledge of the time were left untreated. Died. Their suffering was reframed as holy endurance, and their deaths held up as lessons to scare the others into compliance. Education was another tool of control. Literacy was presented as a reward granted or revoked depending on obedience. This created a climate of fear and competition. Children were taught to read and write, not for their own benefit, but to better serve the institution's bureaucratic and financial needs. They copied texts, produced goods, tended land, and supported entire economic structures, all while receiving only minimal sustenance and shelter. This was not education. It was calculated dependency. The psychological consequences ran deep. Children who made it to adulthood often passed down the same behaviors inflicted upon them. Having internalized years of indoctrination, they saw cruelty as discipline and exploitation as duty. Some remained in the same institutions, carrying forward patterns of control, ensuring that cycles of trauma endured across generations. Selection of children was no accident. Institutions targeted the most vulnerable orphans, the poor, and those with disabilities, knowing they had the fewest protectors and were less likely to be missed. These children were viewed as excess population, disposable, and useful only. As laborers under divine justification, even death served a purpose within this system. When children succumbed to overwork, sickness, or neglect, their demise was turned into a symbol of piety. Their pain was portrayed as voluntary sacrifice. Their lives were romanticized in sermons to encourage the living to embrace suffering as noble. Death became a teaching tool, further embedding control over the survivors. This spiritual lens shielded institutions from criticism. Abuse became discipline. Exploitation became religious service. Hardship was sanctified, and questioning any of it meant doubting divine wisdom. The entire system was armored in faith, silencing dissenters and outsiders alike. The children had no voice, no defenders, and no escape. They were wholly reliant on those same institutions that deprived them of autonomy and dignity. It was a perfect system of captivity, moral and spiritual. And as the early morning light illuminated the fields and rooftops of medieval towns, it failed to reach the darkest corners of monasteries and guild halls where this quiet suffering persisted, hidden in plain sight. The reality of medieval child labor wasn't just severe, it was deliberately constructed. What appeared as isolated hardship was actually part of a carefully orchestrated mechanism designed to eliminate childhood. Altogether, the most chilling truth? This wasn't incidental, it was engineered. The destruction of hope, the erosion of trust, the reprogramming of thought, all done methodically. This was psychological warfare long before the term existed. While today, we revere the architecture, artwork, and manuscripts of the medieval world. Many were created at an unthinkable cost. Children born into merchant guild families endured their own horrors. These institutions, portrayed as centers of commerce and progress, were, in truth, factories of coercion. In tanneries, forges, and textile shops, children as young as 5 became part of an invisible economy. Powered by broken minds and damaged bodies, craftmasters had long understood that emotional submission yielded greater obedience, so they refined methods of control over generations. These weren't informal cruelties, they were structured systems of psychological suppression. Young apprentices were separated from their parents early, eliminating any familial emotional support. A child who remembered maternal comfort, they believed, was harder to control. In the leather shops of Florence and the blacksmith forges of Nuremberg, children handled dangerous chemicals, toxic fumes, and extreme heat, all before their bodies had developed the strength to endure such environments. But worse than the physical strain was the emotional manipulation. Masters used rudimentary, but effective, psychological strategies fluctuating between cruelty and small rewards. To break a child's will while maintaining just enough hope to prevent collapse, a child might labor 18 hours with no rest. They do receive a small piece of bread or a rare kind word. These brief moments of kindness were calculated to keep the child emotionally tethered, confusing gratitude with submission. In time, many learned to equate survival with compliance, and even began to defend the very system that hurt them. The system even tolerated accidents, but not out of neglect. Injuries were often the result of inadequate training and non-existent safety precautions. These accidents served two purposes: removing weaker children and reinforcing fear among the rest. Every incident was documented not to improve safety, but to optimize fear levels and productivity. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the practice of spirit marking. New apprentices underwent public rituals of humiliation meant to destroy self-worth. Stripped of clothing and dignity, children were forced to confess imagined failures, while older workers berated them. These events were as much about performance as punishment, intended to brand the child's mind with shame and solidify their role as property, not people. This calculated system of domination was presented as tradition, as training, as destiny. But beneath the cloaks and scrolls, the hammers and anvils, the incense and sermons, lay a brutal truth. Childhood had been redefined, not as a stage of life, but as a resource to be used, controlled, and discarded when no longer profitable. Those who completely broke under the weight of abuse were seen as perfectly molded for their future roles in servitude. But the guilds were only one part of a broader, deeply rooted system of medieval child exploitation. In the grand estates of the nobility, a different, yet equally disturbing form of cruelty played out, one not limited to labor, but rooted in power and control. Here children were not just workers, but objects of amusement. Aristocrats took in peasant children not out of generosity, but to satisfy a desire to dominate and manipulate lives that could not resist. Among the more troubling customs was something referred to as child games, where noble children were encouraged to devise punishments or challenges for their young servants under the pretense of play. These activities reinforced ideas of hierarchy and dehumanization, teaching noble youth early on that the suffering of the lower classes was a spectacle, not a concern.
Nice.
In some cases, peasant children were made to compete against each other for scraps of food while nobles looked on, or to participate in games that involved dangerous stunts. Promises of release or reward were dangled before them, but rarely fulfilled. Some aristocrats went further, transforming their private chambers into twisted laboratories for observing human endurance. These disciplined rooms, cloaked under terms like training halls or servant quarters, which became places where physical and psychological torment was inflicted under the guise of building loyalty. One such figure was Lady Eleanor d'Ant, a 13th-century noblewoman known among her peers for her structured approach to obedience training. Her methods included layers of humiliation designed to break down a child's sense of identity and self-worth. So notorious were her methods that members of other noble households sent envoys to observe and learn from her techniques. Children raised in such households lived in constant fear. The unpredictability of their master's moods meant that even the smallest misstep could result in severe consequences. To survive, they learned to predict the emotions of adults with unnatural precision, moving silently through corridors, avoiding attention unless directly summoned. Despite the severity of these conditions, the institutional abuse present in religious settings often surpassed even these aristocratic cruelties. While earlier sections explored the suffering of children in monasteries to the broader reach of ecclesiastical institutions revealed something more, a complete philosophical framework built to rationalize and sustain that suffering. Far from isolated cruelty, the Church had developed an entire system of belief around child pain, one that framed deprivation, hardship, and punishment as necessary paths to holiness. The concept of sanctified suffering suggested that young souls stained by original sin could only achieve salvation through hardship. This ideology gave clergy and educators license to enforce extreme discipline. Some religious scholars argued that showing compassion to children endangered their eternal souls by weakening their resolve. In cathedral schools across Europe, young boys, especially those selected for the priesthood, were immersed in an environment of constant surveillance, physical rigor, and emotional detachment. The process began with separation from their families, erasing emotional support and establishing dependence on the institution alone. Strict routines included controlled food intake, interrupted sleep, and regular correction through corporal punishment. These measures weren't random, they were calibrated to reshape the child's identity. Individuality was discouraged. Group conformity and unwavering obedience were praised. Acts of independence triggered intensified scrutiny. Boys were made to confess to faults they hadn't committed and request punishments as part of their moral development. The goal wasn't just discipline, it was psychological re-engineering. To further divide and control, institutions trained children to report on each other. This system of internal policing destroyed trust among peers. Friendship was viewed as a threat to obedience. Kindness was discouraged, and those who showed too much compassion were isolated. In time, the most obedient children, the ones who had most fully internalized the system's values, rose through the ranks. They became the next generation of leaders, carrying forward the same traditions they had endured. But what truly set this era apart wasn't just the brutality, it was how universally accepted it was. No area of medieval society offered refuge. Children could not expect protection even in their own homes. Families, often struggling with extreme poverty, viewed children through a lens of economic necessity. Love and nurture were luxuries few could afford. Instead, children were seen as potential income sources, tools for survival in a harsh world. Many parents, out of desperation, entered their children into service, often with full knowledge of what that meant. These were not rare events, they were normal transactions. Entire markets emerged for this purpose. Children were traded openly, their value assessed by age, strength, or temperament. These child markets were public and often regulated by both civic and religious authorities. Co-collected taxes and fees from each exchange. The psychological toll on the children caught in this system was profound. They internalized the belief that their worth was conditional, that they mattered only when they served a function or pleased an authority figure. With no experience of being valued for who they were, many came to believe they were inherently unworthy. This mindset shaped their identities and determined how they related to others for the rest of their lives. Medieval society had, intentionally or not, created an efficient mechanism for producing broken people. Every major institution, the church, the nobility, the economic system, and even the family unit, played a role in reinforcing the same brutal lesson that children were not to be cherished, but used. The result was a population of individuals who rarely knew kindness in childhood. Few experienced safety, affection, or emotional validation. The cultural narrative taught them that these things were either dangerous, shameful, or impossible. Entire generations grew up disconnected from the very aspects of life that make it meaningful. This wasn't the result of one villain or isolated events. It was the cumulative effect of policies, ideologies, and norms that prioritized control, productivity, and spiritual conformity over humanity. And now, as we attempt to uncover the full scope of this hidden history, we are forced to accept an uncomfortable truth. What happened wasn't accidental. It was systematic, deliberate, calculated. The abuse of children in the Middle Ages wasn't just a product of ignorance or hardship. It was the end result of values taken to cruel extremes, values that prized authority above empathy, productivity over personhood, and conformity over compassion. And in recognizing this, we must ask difficult questions about the values we hold today. The systems of the past may be gone, but their echoes remain in places where children are still vulnerable to exploitation, especially when economic pressure, institutional power, religious justification are used to excuse harm. What makes this history so harrowing is that its architects weren't monsters or outliers. They were ordinary people, priests, teachers, parents, nobles, who had come to believe that they were doing the right thing. The horror wasn't just what they did, but how they justified it. These individuals operated within social and moral frameworks that turned suffering into virtue and silence into righteousness. The most lasting damage wasn't only physical, though the pain was real and devastating. The true harm lay in the way these children's inner lives were reshaped. Hope was reframed as folly. Love was dismissed as weakness. Bonds between people were undermined at every turn because unity bred resistance, and resistance threatened. Control, in this context, the destruction of childhood, wasn't collateral damage. It was the goal. A child who had never known safety, love, or freedom was easier to control, easier to silence, easier to shape into a compliant tool. And so, the legacy of medieval child labor becomes not only a record of suffering, but a warning. It shows how deeply a society can entrench harm when its systems lose sight of the value of individual life. It shows how cruelty can be dressed up as righteousness, and how easy it is for ordinary people to become agents of extraordinary harm when they stop seeing children as people and start seeing them as means to an end. Entire economies had been built on the unspoken assumption that children would provide the cheapest and most expendable form of labor. Agriculture, textiles, mining, domestic service, virtually every major sector in medieval Europe relied on the endurance and obedience of young workers. To remove children from these systems would have required nothing less than a total reorganization of society, something the ruling classes were neither willing nor able to imagine. Their comfort, profit, and authority were too deeply intertwined. With the suffering of the young, social hierarchies meant the forms of exploitation varied depending on class. But no child was truly safe. Those born into nobility were spared the mines and fields, but their fates were often no less oppressive. They were political instruments from birth, bartered through arranged marriages and burdened with dynastic expectations that left no room for personal agency. Merchant children, meanwhile, were groomed for commerce, bound to family trades that measured them by productivity rather than potential. And peasant children, by far the most numerous, carried the heaviest weight. For them, childhood often meant unrelenting labor, constant hunger, and the lingering fear of being cast aside during times of hardship. Perhaps the most haunting legacy of this world is how thoroughly child suffering had been normalized. Many children never realized their pain was anything but the natural order. From the moment they could walk, they were taught that hardship was virtue, that obedience was survival, and that their bodies did not belong to them. Adults were authority, labor was duty, and dreams were indulgences for those born lucky. With no language to express injustice and no model for compassion, many of these children came to accept their abuse not just as unavoidable, but as deserved. This psychological conditioning ensured the system's survival across generations. Adults who had grown up under these brutal regimes often perpetuated them, convinced that discipline was character building and that kindness bred weakness. These ideas became so embedded in cultural norms that even institutions claiming to protect children often served as some of the most efficient engines of exploitation. Religious schools and monastic institutions developed elaborate systems to extract maximum labor while offering minimal education. Young students were told they were receiving a sacred opportunity, but the reality was far grimmer. Days were consumed with copying texts, repairing buildings, scrubbing floors, and obeying. Complex routines that left little time for actual learning. Knowledge was rationed out just enough to make children more useful to the institution, never enough to empower them. And yet they were encouraged to feel grateful, to believe they were chosen, blessed even, for the chance to serve. This sense of manufactured gratitude was a particularly cruel form of manipulation. Children were taught that their suffering was noble, that their obedience was holy, and that any resistance was a rejection of divine purpose. Behind the sermons and prayers was a system designed to reshape not just behavior, but identity. Every compliment came with a cost. Every moment of kindness was calculated. Approval was a tool, not a gift. Even the so-called science of the time was twisted to support this system. Physicians and natural philosophers advanced theories that reinforced exploitation. They claimed children's bodies were inherently suited for hard labor, that young bones were flexible, that developing muscles could recover faster, that hardship accelerated moral growth. These claims, though entirely unfounded, were repeated often enough to gain credibility. They gave employers and clergy intellectual cover to do what they were already doing: work children to the brink. What's perhaps most chilling is how intentional the emotional control had become. Children were rarely punished for infractions. Alone, they were taught to police themselves and each other. They competed for scraps of affection or marginal privileges. Praise was rare and weaponized. To prevent solidarity, children were turned into rivals, each desperate to gain favor, no matter how small. Friendships were discouraged. Emotional bonds were viewed as threats to institutional order. Their families, when mentioned, were often cast as the reason for their suffering. Children were told they had been given away because they were weak, because they were burdens. This narrative stripped away any remaining sense of belonging. Even their memories became suspect. Longing for home was painted as ingratitude. Love was recast as abandonment. The child's inner world, already fragile, was systematically broken down and rebuilt in the image of their masters. The religious component of this control extended well beyond doctrine. Children were made to believe that questioning their treatment was a betrayal not just of authority, but of God. Their suffering was reframed as sacrifice. Their pain was called prayer. Ceremonies were held in which they were required to give thanks for their hardships and pledge renewed submission to their keepers. These rituals fused spiritual identity with subjugation, ensuring that the children felt guilt not only for disobedience, but even for thinking about it. This spiritual distortion was among the most devastating aspects of the entire system. Didn't just force compliance, it redefined right and wrong. A child raised in such a setting might never learn what justice truly meant. They would come to believe that fairness was rebellion, that kindness was dangerous, and that their worth was directly tied to how well they could endure harm. It was a moral inversion so complete that even survivors often carried its weight into adulthood, convinced that their pain had made them good. In parallel, the law turned a blind eye. What few legal protections existed for adults were simply not applied to children. Laws prohibiting assault, false imprisonment, theft often excluded minors when the perpetrator was a parent, guardian, or employer. Courts routinely refused to hear testimony from children, deeming them too unreliable to be witnesses. As a result, even in the rare moments when abuse was visible and undeniable, there was no mechanism for justice. This wasn't oversight, it was policy. The legal system had been carefully shaped to protect those who profited from child labor, not those who endured it. Exemptions were baked into the code. Guardians were granted near total authority. Institutions were shielded from scrutiny. If a child collapsed from overwork, it was a tragedy but never a crime. If they died, they were mourned quietly and replaced efficiently. The economic logic behind this cruelty was as ruthless as it was precise. Masters calculated the bare minimum required to keep a child alive and functional. Meals, rest, and clothing were rationed to stretch every coin. Breaks were minimized, injuries triaged, and replacements lined up. If a child could no longer work, another would take their place. The system was self-replenishing, cold, methodical, and efficient. As we reach the end of this examination, it is crucial to understand what this system truly was. It's not just a set of unfortunate practices, not a few cruel outliers, but a deeply embedded, fully integrated machinery of exploitation, a society-wide structure that regarded children not as individuals to protect, but as resources to be consumed. It was built and sustained by the very institutions that claimed moral leadership. Religious authorities gave it theological legitimacy. Legal frameworks gave it structure. Intellectual traditions gave it credibility. And economic systems gave it motive. Every part worked in harmony to turn suffering into routine and innocence, into opportunity. The voices of the children themselves are largely lost to time. Most never had the chance to leave records. They died young or grew up too burdened by silence and trauma to speak out. But their presence still echoes in the buildings they built, the fields they worked, the manuscripts they copied. Right there. Fingerprints are on the bones of history, even if their names were forgotten. We must not allow that forgetting to continue. These children were not statistics or symbols. They were people with thoughts, fears, dreams, and a desire for love. They were children who deserved to be held, taught, protected, and cherished. Instead, they were worked, beaten, silenced, and thrown away. That should never have been acceptable, must never be excused, because their suffering was not inevitable. It was chosen by those who could have acted differently, could have built a better world, but decided instead to reinforce the one that served their own power. Every adult who enforced the system, every leader who defended it, every scholar who rationalized it had a choice, and they chose wrongly. We study this not out of morbid fascination, but out of moral necessity, because history does not end. The systems of yesterday shape the choices of today, and the same force is economic pressure, institutional power, and ideological dogma can still be used to justify harm. Our awareness must not end with knowledge. It must awaken responsibility. The exploitation of children did not die with the Middle Ages. It changed forms. It moved. It adapted. And unless we are vigilant, it will continue. The children of medieval Europe deserve more than to be remembered as victims. They deserve to be honored as people whose lives had value even if their society failed to see it. They deserve to be recognized. And perhaps in our recognition, we can give them the dignity they were so long denied.